Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever it is for you. For me, it is just past midnight on Thursday, December the 5th, 2024, which makes this the news for Wednesday, December the 4th, 2024, day 1015 of Vladimir Putin's war of aggression against the people of Ukraine. How do you do? I'm Peter Alexievich, and this is the Live at 5 from Kyiv. I'm coming to you from this major European capital city that is under siege from the orcs. How's everybody doing tonight? I see the peeps are coming in. Anthony, PH, Vanetta, Cheyenne, how you guys doing? Nicola is here. Herb is here. Darlene is here. Hey, Darlene. I just read your comment on the thing. It was quite a missive. Nice. Anthony's making sandwiches at 10 o'clock at night. And Bobby's here from sunny San Diego. Vinay, how you doing? Eli, there's Eli. Rocco. Hey, Rosie in Iowa. I was just in Iowa before I came over here. I say just, I've been here 2 years now. Time flies, man. Hey, Chef Deb. Hey, Mel. How's everybody doing tonight? Hey, Little Red Sunflower. So I want to start by thanking Elizabeth Johnson, who I don't know who that is, and I don't know what her handle is on TikTok. I sent her an email, but she very generously sent me some money for a live sponsorship. So Elizabeth Johnson is the sponsor of tonight's live. And I don't normally use people's real names, but that's all I have to go on. I don't know who she is. I haven't seen any interaction with anybody by that name. I would love to know who you are, Elizabeth. Maybe send me a message if you see this. But big thanks to Elizabeth Johnson, who is... Oh, is that you, Little Red Sunflower? How would I know that? I texted you. Tell me who you are. Well, thank you. It's Little Red Sunflower. Thanks so much. Okay, so let's begin then with last night's drone attack on the territory of Ukraine. The Russian Federation sent 50 attack drones of the Shahed class onto the territory of Ukraine, of which 29 were shot down by territorial defense. 18 were lost, presumably due to electronic warfare. How many of those were redirected? We don't know. We know that the Ukrainians are spoofing these things somehow, sending them off course, and they are ending up in Belarus and Russia and the temporarily occupied territories, where not only is the threat to Ukraine neutralized, but they keep the enemy's air defense busy themselves. The Air Force did acknowledge that one had been returned to sender. It was sent back to the temporarily occupied territories. That is a total of 48 out of 50 drones, a 96% interception rate on the part of the Ukrainians. Now, that's all good, right? It's great. But those drones that got through damaged energy infrastructure. I woke up, very commonly these days, I'm waking up to being in the dark. And then we had another power outage this afternoon. So they're having an impact. Nothing like the impact on the Russian forces that the Ukrainians are having. Look at the front line isn't moving. And yet yesterday, December 3rd alone, we saw 180 combat engagements across the front line with the Russians taking heavy losses all up and down the line. An incredible story came out of Kursk today. A company of Marines in a trench in Kursk had been reduced to just 2 Marines after facing God knows what kind of onslaughts. The 2 Marines that were left in the trench were notified. A reconnaissance drone had spotted 20 Russians approaching their position. These 2 Marines, in a pitched battle with the Russians, fought off and eliminated 20 Russians, 2 to 20. Those are the kind of odds the Ukrainians are facing. Those are the kinds of sacrifices that the Russians have to make to gain every meter of ground that they are gaining. Look, Russia is famous for being able to take the hits, for not caring about human life and watching thousands and thousands of their own men thrown into the meat grinder willingly. But how long can they take this? How long can they possibly take these kinds of losses? It's insanity to me. Further, it has come out today. There are Russian prisoners of war who are asserting that they received commands from the Russian command. Rather than be taken prisoner, they should unalive themselves. Right? That it is their duty to maintain their honor to the bitter end. And so they don't want anybody being taken prisoner. They would rather that they offed themselves in the field. Hey, Renvox, how you doing? Tonight, I want to talk about something that we have never talked about in any kind of detail, but I think is worth examining in light of the current situation in Syria. The situation in Syria is that Russian forces have pulled out of there to go to Ukraine. They were a main supporter of the Bashar al-Assad regime. Hezbollah has been decimated by the Israelis in the war that Vladimir Putin started to detract from Ukraine. And so a second pillar of support for the Assad regime is gone. They don't have Hezbollah to rely on. And Iran, the third pillar of support, is having its own trouble with Israel, having started a war there in collusion with the Russians. And they can't do much to help Assad right now. So the Assad regime is in trouble. They turn to Moscow. As far as I know, Bashar al-Assad fled the country immediately, has been in Moscow since this started, and is begging Moscow for help. Well, Moscow can't send anybody from Russia. Moscow can't send anybody from Ukraine. So where are they pulling the people from? They're pulling Wagner mercenaries from Africa. Now, there are not that many Wagner mercenaries in Africa anymore. There may be, according to the research I did today, there is likely less than 20,000 today, down from 50,000 at its height under Yevgeny Prigozhin. Those guys are up to a lot of shit in Africa. And I thought it was worth talking about because, look, if these Russians are in Africa propping up dictatorships or supporting rebels trying to destabilize governments in Africa, if they get pulled out of Africa to Syria, which that's what the Russians are doing, then what's going to happen to their influence in Africa? We could well see further destabilization there. So I want to talk about Wagner in Africa, and I want to give you some sense of what the Wagner, the Russian presence in Africa is like, and what they're getting for their presence there. And the first thing we'll talk about is Mali. In Mali, the Russians have been propping up the military junta there since at least September 30th of 2021, when the first deliveries to Mali from Russia arrived in the form of 4 Mi-17 helicopters. That's the export version of the Mi-8. 1,000 troops to train Mali forces, arms and ammunition. The Secretary of Defense praised the Russians as friends of long standing, who they could count on in their defense. Less than 1 year later, by April, Human Rights Watch had filed a brief in which it accused Wagner forces of a massacre of 300 civilians in the north of the country. where the rebel forces were stationed. By June of 2022, there were accusations of the Wagners looting towns, mass arrests, grape as a tool of violence, and the unaliving of civilians, driving a population of 1.4 million into refugee status in neighboring Mauritania, just driving the people right out of the country. By July 2024, Tuareg rebels with Ukrainian intelligence and drone support ambushed Russian and Malayan forces and gave them their first defeat in Mali, their first serious defeat. So the Russians have been embedded there with the Malayans, with the Malayan military junta for at least 3 years. In that time, thousands of civilians have met a tragic end. Towns have been wiped from the map using the classic burn everything approach of the Russians. People have been driven into exile. And it wasn't until Ukraine supported the Mali rebels with intelligence and drones that they were able to win decisively in a battle against these forces. They took it on the chin there. So not only are we seeing the Ukrainians help rebels in Syria, we're seeing them help them in Mali. In the Sudan, it's the opposite situation. In the Sudan, the rebels are being assisted by the Russians, by the Wagner forces, now called the Africa Corps, in trying to destabilize the legitimate government. And so Russia is playing with whoever creates the most chaos and can finance them the best. Ideology doesn't come into this, except to make sure that everybody else is weak and dependent on you. In Burkina Faso, they support the military junta in its fight against a jihadi insurgency that has left 2,000 dead and 1.4 million refugees. How are they being paid? They were given a gold mine to run. How do you think they're paying for those Iranian drones? Gold shipments from Africa. That's how they pay for them. Gold from Africa. In Chad, it's the same situation as in the Sudan. They work with the rebels to destabilize the government. Look, we could literally do this all night. The list goes on. Mozambique, Madagascar, Libya, Central African Republic. Russian paramilitary forces prop up dictators and try to destabilize emergent nation states on the African continent. All for the reasons of securing natural resources for themselves. Gold mines, diamond mines, rare earth minerals, timber. In the Central African Republic, the Wagner forces have been granted the timbering rights to a huge parcel of forest and are mowing it down, regardless of the ecological impacts, of course. They are just there for the money. The Institute, in addition, they gain strategic assets in Africa. Air bases and ports. What are we seeing in Syria? We're seeing that the reason that the Russians are there is because they got an air base from Assad. They got a naval base from Assad. They can extend their power to that part of the world and show that power off. Now, today, we know that the rebels are only 35 kilometers from Khamenei Air Base. Right? In Syria, the rebels are only 35 kilometers from Khamenei Air Base, where the Russians are. That's within MLRS range. They could potentially, as these planes come in from Africa transporting troops, they could potentially knock them out of the sky. And they would never get on the ground, which is exactly, of course, what they should do, if they can. The Institute of Political Studies in Prague described Wagner's operations in the Central African Republic as a neo-imperialist, neo-colonial kind of state capture, in which the Central African Republic exists only as a resource to be extracted for the benefit of Russia with complete disregard to the people who live there, which is Russia's attitude toward everybody and everything. The only thing that matters is Russia. Everybody else is there to be used by them. Geopolitical influence operations to advance Russian interests while generating anti-Western sentiment on the continent include election interference, pro-Russian, and anti-Western propaganda. In writing for The Hill, Stephen Blank referred to Russia's Africa policy as the quintessence of imperialism. To see Africans and African nations cheering for Russia as they are simultaneously subverted by this colonial power, exercising its imperialistic ambitions against them, is heartbreaking, just as Africa is really extracting itself out from under the thumb of late-stage colonialism. So when we think about the countries to watch, definitely where Russia is propping up the regime, if they're pulling troops from Mozambique, if they're pulling troops from Mali, if they're pulling troops from Burkina Faso, if they're pulling troops from the Central African Republic, then suddenly those regimes become the next regimes in Russia's house of cards that we could expect to see have some trouble with the locals. And I would argue that there are too few Wagnerites left in Africa to make much of a difference in Syria. It'll be interesting to see what happens when and if they arrive on the ground. It's being said that Assad forces have been bolstered by about 300 Iraqi fighters that have come across the border and are now engaging anti-Assad forces around the town of Hama, which is where the fighting is happening now. So the progress of the rebels has slowed in Syria, and fighting is really taking up a more traditional position. In Georgia, the police are pushing back. The violence is escalating. In addition to rubber bullets and water cannons, the police came out in huge force yesterday, along with tear gas, trying to clear the streets of the massive crowds. They have failed. The people are still there, day 6. It's estimated 200,000, 20% of the population of Tbilisi is in the streets standing up to this Russian-backed government. Meanwhile, we got more notices of resignations of officials from the Georgian Dream Party. Now, we don't know what that means. We don't know if within the Georgian Dream Party they're reshuffling, or if people are scared and the end is in sight for this Russian-backed coup by the Georgian Dream Party. Last night, we saw a large drone attack on the Russian Federation. We saw drones in Novorossiysk. Air defense was active in Rostov, Bryansk, Belgorod, Ryazan, Astrakhan, Kaluga, and Krasnodar regions. And this morning, I thought that we would see what got hit. I thought we'd see, an oil depot here, an oil refinery there, an air base here. But we got no word today of any hits inside of Russia last night. Is it possible that Russian air defense is doing its job? It's not impossible, I guess. Or something else is going on. We're not being told, but we got no further word on that, only that the attack had happened. Now, the buffoon in boat shoes, Tucker Carlson, is back paying obeisance to his Kremlin masters and trying to scare the world with threats of nuclear retaliation from the Russians. He's screaming that Biden is doing everything he can to push Russia into a nuclear exchange with America. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I'm with you, Laurel. I loathe that son of a bitch myself. I mean, really. I watched a little bit of Eli sent me, I think, right, Eli, you sent me that video of him. The first words out of his mouth were a lie. The guy got fired from Fox for costing Fox $787 million for the lies he told the American people about the election. And now his fans just sit there lapping up the lies and applauding like there's no tomorrow. It's insanity. I watched Tucker Carlson say the words that the American military is in Kursk, Russia, firing weapons at Russian troops and unaliving Russian troops on the battlefield. He said it 3 times that the American military is unaliving Russian troops on the battlefield. This is nonsense of the first order. Anybody, they do love being lied to. You're right, Devin. That's exactly what it is. They love being lied to. There is a percentage of this species that would prefer a comforting lie every time over the truth, if that truth is in any way hard. It's the maggots. That's the percentage of the population I'm talking about, Eric. That's who it is. And it's not rational. I don't know if it's technically insane, but it's certainly not rational. Anthony, unfortunately, we have to claim Tucker Carlson as one of our own. Yes, we do. Hey, Richard Hansen. Anthony, unfortunately, we have to claim Tucker Carlson as one of our own. Yes, we do. Hey, Richard Hansen. You read that Carlson is suggesting Trump's cabinet picks. I can't believe this. How could you not believe it? That seems perfectly reasonable to me, Bobby. Right in line with everything we know about this guy. If we were there, it would be done by now. Right, James? You're damn right it would be. Ugh. I don't know what's going to happen to Tucker Carlson. The press get a lot of freedom in this country. He is a citizen. He's a natural-born citizen. It's going to be hard to just revoke his passport. But at any rate, Tucker Carlson who has been made completely irrelevant by his Fox firing and the failure of his Twitter talk show. Now he has no choice but to cozy up to our enemies in an effort to try to be relevant and very likely to line his own pockets. You can be sure there's money in it for him. In Syria, the ISW has reported that the Tartus naval base has been evacuated. We assumed that something like that would happen, given that the head of the Russian Navy, Admiral Musyov himself, was on the ground in Tartus as soon as news of the rebel advances broke. Satellites have confirmed that the entire Mediterranean fleet, as well as a couple of rust buckets that have been damaged from the Black Sea fleet, have exited Tartus at this time. Further, satellite imagery of the Khamenei air base shows that it is empty. Now, I rather expected that because, as I understood it, most of the men and equipment had been moved to Ukraine some time ago. But it's really empty. Satellite imagery from yesterday showed only 2 jets and 3 large transport aircraft, one of which had the steps down. So that either means that some Africa Corps fighters arrived and had deplaned, or that they were getting ready to board and get a bunch of people out. One or the other, both maybe, hard to say. Again, rebel troops are only 35 kilometers, about 22 miles from that air base. They are less than 80 kilometers from the Tartus port. It was fascinating to hear something honest and true from a Russian official today. According to Vasily Nebenzia, who is Russia's permanent representative to the UN, he testified before the Security Council that Ukraine was behind the rebels in Syria. And it turns out that he is right. That the GUR has had elements of its Kaminsk unit in Syria for the last 6 months, doing operations, training the Syrians on lessons learned from fighting the Russians in Ukraine, on drone operations. We saw the first use of first-person view drones by the Syrian rebels this week. The Ukrainians are definitely there. And while I don't think the Ukrainians are responsible, I think they helped. And I think that what we're seeing now is Ukraine not just beating the shit out of the Russians in Ukraine, but doing it in Sudan, Mali, and Syria as well. And so we had a representative of the Russian government crying to the UN Security Council, the very council whose charter this government is in complete violation of, complaining to them for help against the big bad Ukrainians who are making life hard for them all over the planet. Russia is not even the second best army in Syria anymore. They're like third or fourth now. Thank you very much. Let's see. German helicopter in NATO Lake. Sorry, it's getting warm in here. 1 second. The heat has been staying on even though the power goes out, which is nice. Okay. Let's see. Germany. So up in NATO Lake, the Baltic Sea, a Russian ship fired signaling flares at a German helicopter, reconnaissance helicopter of the Bundeswehr. Now, you're only permitted to fire signal flares in an actual emergency. You're not supposed to use them offensively the way that these were used. That helicopter was there looking for Russians fucking around. Make no mistake. Patrols of the Baltic are up by all the nations that live on NATO Lake because of this recent thing with the Yang P3 ship that dragged its anchor along the bottom and severed the internet cables between Sweden and Lithuania and Finland and Germany, right? A couple weeks ago that happened. That ship is currently corralled, it's surrounded just outside the Baltic Sea by numerous forces from a number of local countries, all of whom want answers. The Chinese, for their part, have said they will participate in the investigation to discover what happened to those undersea cables. Although increasingly it just looks like it was that Chinese ship. All the evidence points there. And as I understand it, there's no way you can drag your anchor for 100 miles and not know about it. The first thing that happens is you reduce your speed by half when you drop that anchor. So that's a problem. Explaining it away as an accident doesn't make any sense. So all of that, the Russians firing those flares, is just a sign of the increasing tensions in the Baltic Sea over the Russian activity and the ongoing sabotage campaign of Russia's hybrid war against the United States and its allies. The NATO ministerial meeting in Brussels wrapped up today with no offer of NATO membership to Ukraine, as no one expected it. In addition to Hungary and Slovakia, Luxembourg has now joined the chorus of countries opposed to Ukrainian membership in NATO at this time. Very disappointing to hear that from Luxembourg. Let's see. Now, Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister for Germany, said at this Brussels meeting, she was the one that told us about the helicopter incident. But she also suggested that Germany was open to the idea of boots on the ground as part of a peacekeeping force in the event of a ceasefire. Now, Le Monde reported last week, though it was later denied by the respective governments of the UK and France, that the UK and France were talking about putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. Maybe they were talking about in the event of a ceasefire. Now dig it, get this, follow this thinking. Trump wants a ceasefire. Trump wants credit for stopping the war and a Nobel Prize. That's what that fucker really wants, right? He doesn't give a fuck about peace or the Ukrainian people or the goals or ideals of democracy. Let's be clear. He wants a Nobel Prize for himself because Obama got one. So his peace deal basically gives Putin everything. Gives Putin everything. Gives him all the ground he's taken, freezes the conflict where it is, right? But it means you need somebody to keep the peace. Trump wants a piece of ass is what Trump wants. Trump doesn't, you're spelling that wrong. At any rate, somebody's got to patrol that demilitarized zone. Somebody's got to be in there to keep the peace. Well, Trump's not putting Americans in there. He wants the Europeans to do it. Europeans don't want to do it either. No freaking way do they want to do it. But dig it. Suppose they make this offer. They say, okay, we'll handle it. Do you think Putin, who started this war because he didn't want a border with NATO, is going to welcome NATO troops in on his border? It's a non-starter for Putin. It's a non-starter for Putin. Now, that could be the best thing that could happen. Because if Putin refuses Trump's offer, Trump might just turn around and turn Ukraine into the best armed porcupine you ever saw. Every quill, a missile pointed at Moscow. So we'll keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best on this. But she did say that Germany is not closed to the idea of troops on the ground to support a ceasefire. Very interesting. Russia's pushing all along the front line. That now includes Kherson. In Kherson, it is being reported that the Russians have amassed 300 boats on the Dnipro, and it appears that they are getting ready to cross the river to attack the city of Kherson. It looks like we could see a Russian advance on the city anytime in the next couple of weeks. 300 boats waiting to ferry them across. Now, we just got a report that the Indian government had canceled the trip of the head of the Russian State Duma, right? Like our Speaker for the House, right? Like Mike Johnson, the head of the parliament in Russia, was supposed to go to India. But after that little incident with the Oreshnik missile, India wants less and less to have to do anything with Russia. They didn't like the missile test at all, or the attempts at intimidation. And we'll talk more about that in 1 second. Further, the ISW is reporting today that India is trying to decouple its military-industrial complex from Russia, quoting senior Indian officials who said things like, Russian weapons are cheaper, but they break more often and need more maintenance. Thanks, PH. And so their long-term cost is more than simply buying American weapons or South Korean weapons. Now, the reality is that the Indian military-industrial complex is deeply intertwined with the Russian military-industrial complex. It will not be an easy thing to separate the two, but it appears several senior Indian officials speaking to the ISW made the claim that they are doing everything they can to get off of Russia. And that's good news for everybody. Russia was the third largest arms supplier to the world. They have since fallen, if I'm not mistaken, to 5. And it looks like by the end of the year, they could be number 7. Everybody is seeing the failure of Russian weapons on the battlefield. And orders are being canceled or orders aren't getting delivered. They're not getting delivered because everything Russia makes, it sends to Ukraine. Okay, now follow this. Follow this story here. The Moscow Times is saying that they spoke to 4 senior Moscow defense insiders, all of whom confirmed that the Oreshnik missile strike and the subsequent media coverage was a carefully crafted psyop. A carefully crafted psyop. It involved military officials, military agencies, intelligence agencies, and Kremlin PR people. Brainstorming sessions over how to punish America for authorizing strikes on Russian territory and how to scare Berlin to ensure that Taurus missiles would never, a psychological operation, to scare Berlin to ensure that Taurus missiles would never be authorized and scare others in the EU into submission. Quote, this show consisted of the actual strike and other staged events. The big one that many of us saw was the press conference with Maria Zakharova, right, one of Putin's chief propagandists, who just as she was beginning a press conference, her phone rings, she picks it up right by the microphone so we can all hear the guy on the other end say, don't mention missile strike on Dnipro. Click. Perfect example of the sloppy, shoddy, clunky disinformation machinery of the Kremlin. Well, it wasn't an ICBM, so it turned out not to be an ICBM, Anthony. It turned out to be an intermediate range ballistic missile, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, sure. Hypersonic, yes. Very hard to shoot down, definitely. Very short flight time, very little time to respond. But it did very little damage. We don't believe that the Russians have any more of them right now. They may be trying to build some, but they don't have any more, as far as we know. And they are reported to have had a second one, but apparently that failed on launch. They tried to launch that one too, and it failed. So it looks like this missile type has a 50% failure rate at this time. An IRBM, correct, PT, thank you. Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, and other non-binary folks, that's the top line from the headlines today from me. And I think some critical background on Africa and Russia in Africa, because I think that that's the next place we're going to see surprising dominoes fall. Dominoes that we didn't have on our bingo cards, right? I want to thank Little Red Sunflower, who is the sponsor of tonight's live. Thank you, Little Red. I want to thank the moderator team, Cheyenne, Vanetta, PT, Jay, and Travis, best moderators on the Tickety Talk. I want to thank Nightshade, who has the Peter's Peeps group on the Book of Faces, and Lars, who has the Discord server and the Alexievich archive. And so now we'll just go to Q&A in the chat. Okay, so good. Blue Ariel Silk found the Russian Africa background helpful. I want to stress that that barely scratches the surface of the complex nature of the Russian presence in Africa. But what we've done is identify the real hotspots: Sudan, Chad, Mali, Central African Republic, Mozambique, and Madagascar. Any and all of these, we could see potential violent flare-ups in over the next few weeks if they're really pulling the Russians out of those places to send to Syria. Thanks, Lil Red. Thanks, Anthony. Thank you, Blue Ariel Silk. Russia claiming 400K defense industry labor shortage. I have heard, the number that I hear quoted is that Russia right now is short about 4.3 million laborers for what the economy demands. That's a problem. If you, right, that's why butter is 60% more expensive now than it was. It's the classic guns and butter scenario that we all learned in Economics 101. A state has a limited amount of resources and manpower. You can make so many guns or you can make so much butter. If you need to make more guns, you need to make less butter. And so the price of butter is skyrocketing as people are pulled out of the farms and into the defense plants or to the front line. On the bright side, there was no alien war yesterday, Van. You are correct. Shoot, wouldn't that have been nice? That would have been a nice distraction from Ukraine. Would Russia have had to inform other countries before using those IRBMs that weren't nuclear? Yes, Anthony, and in fact, they did. 30 minutes before the launch, there was definitely a call to the White House. We know that. It's very likely that there was a call to Beijing, that there was a call to Delhi, that there was a call, right? All the nuclear powers, you're going to have to, anybody with long-range radar capabilities looking for ICBM missile launches could not have told the difference between that launch and an ICBM. You couldn't do it because the missile itself is just a retrofitted RU-26, which is an ICBM. So they had to make those calls to the other nuclear powers or risk a very bad misunderstanding. And it's our understanding that they did make those calls. How long will the bridge last? I don't know, man. I just don't think that the bridge is, when you only have so many ATACMs, when you only have so many storm shadows, and there are other targets that are more likely to unalive your people than that bridge, you got to choose the other targets, I think. It's just not that important right now, I think, is what's going on. United Healthcare CEO killed today. I'm unaware of that. I don't have any idea. Is that why Biden went there? He is in Africa today, right? Where is he, though? I don't know where he is, so I can't say. Those trips are planned well in advance, so it could not have been a reaction to this recent event. No. I'm going to say no, Luna's mom. I don't think so. If the rebels in Syria can close that airbase, that might bring the Russian House of Cards crashing down. It's not going to help, that's for sure. You're right about that, Bobby. And it would be great to see it lost to the rebels. Anywhere that Russia is denied its power is a good day for the rest of the world. Hey, Sergey. Has Ukraine still only received 10% of the weapons the West has promised? No. Depending on the category, the last that I saw, it's anywhere from 53% to 79%. So like different categories like shells, missiles, vehicles, it varies. We just had Anthony Blinken today repeat what Jake Sullivan said yesterday, that all $61 billion in aid will be delivered before the end of the president's term, which is impossible. It's just impossible. They're never going to do that. They're never going to make that. I don't know why they're saying it. There's the intent to get it, I guess. But even now, the Pentagon is coming up against its own limitations. And it can't do more to deliver more any faster than it is. So it's very hard to say what they're actually going to get. Do we know how many long-range missiles Ukraine has? No, we do not. Butter is better. What made the baby's butter bitter? Oh, no, it was butter that made the baby batter bitter, wasn't it? I don't know, something like that. Let's see here. Fitz is here. He's in Africa. He's in Angola. I don't know why he's in Angola. I will check. I will have to look and see. I don't know. Peter or Darlene, I did see that the French government held a vote of no confidence today, and the government has collapsed. Have the glide bombs slowed down? They had at one point. They picked up again. Anthony, I haven't seen any recent data. I'm not hearing reports of a lot of strikes like we were hearing against civilian infrastructure with glide bombs. I'm not hearing those reports anymore. It's been at least a few days since Kyiv was hit by one. So not sure. South Korea is crazy. I don't know what's going on there either. CEO just gunned down on 54th Street in New York City. Now, somebody suggested that it was because they deny claims. Insurance companies are the worst. They are absolutely the worst. Hey, what's up, Mr. Dvorak? What are you doing, Misha? Syria rebels captured advanced Russian radar systems. They should sell them to Ukraine. After the help they got from Ukraine, they should give them to Ukraine. Delivered it doesn't seem realistic to me either. It's very upsetting. The whole thing is the whole crisis over here it makes me crazy, because we made all these promises to these people and we have not come through. And it does seem like we have given them just enough not to fail, but not enough to succeed. And that kind of cynicism makes me crazy. If that's what's really been going on, it's really a disappointing today. We Americans have had enough. Spoiled, rotten, stupid sons of bitches. What is wrong with you? You've had enough of what? Prosperity, peace, and good fortune? Everything you want on a silver fucking platter? Power that never goes out, safe drinking water, the best healthcare system in the world? And you've had enough, have you? That you're going to sell it all away to some orange turd who's made promises to you that appeal to your worst, most racist, basic instincts. You're disgusting. Pugga Mahone says Taurus will be available in March of 25. I guess so, if MERS gets in, right? The opposition candidate, Scholz's opposition candidate in Germany, has promised Taurus. The U.S. has outsourced too much manufacturing to China to produce weapons fast enough for 1,000 a day. Yeah, that doesn't have anything to do with China. We don't do weapons manufacture in China. All of that's still in the U.S. Betty Botter bought some butter, but she said the butter's bitter. And the butter Betty Botter bought made her batter bitter. Oh, Biden's in Africa opposing Belt and Road initiatives, right? So China's been I don't want to say blackmailing, but they've been trapping African countries in these debt traps called the Belt and Road Initiative, where they'll give, like Mozambique. They'll give Mozambique $500 million to build a new port, a new deep water port that Russian merchant ships can come into. Mozambique builds the port, but they can't pay back the loan, so then China owns the port. And that's what they've been doing. China's in trouble with that. Half of the Belt and Road Initiative loans are in default. It's something like, don't quote me on this, but if I'm not mistaken, it's something like 300 billion of the 600 billion they've put out is in default. And a bunch of that is Russian. Friction between Russia and Belarus. Well, there's a lot of friction. I don't know if you're hearing about friction between Russia and Belarus as much as you're hearing about friction between the Belarusian people and Uncle Luka. There's some friction there just over the weekend. We saw Belarusian partisans burn a supply train headed to Ukraine or headed to Russia with supplies for the Russian military. In Angola to build infrastructure to move minerals to ports that go to USA. Well, that's going to be really important now that the Chinese have banned rare earth sales to the US, huh? Did you see that? I didn't know anything about it. Somebody brought it up on last night's live, and I looked it up today. And that trade war is now underway. So Trump is doing a great job. Women's March, January 18th in D.C. Oh, shoot, I was supposed to say that, wasn't I? Sorry, Little Red Sunflower. Little Red Sunflower didn't want me to say she was the sponsor tonight. You should have. One of those was. Never mind. Anyway, I didn't get it. But rather to promote the Women's March in D.C. on January 18th. Van, I'm sorry. I'm so repressed, so stoic. I'll try to work on it and try to tell you how I really feel in the future. Why doesn't Ukraine make some nukes for his own? They had them before. They have the know-how. They do have the know-how. But the Ukrainians are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and nukes are more of a problem than they're worth. They're only worth anything if you don't use them. If you use them, you're fucked. as North Korea, Iran, and Russia could very well be about to find out. If they are so unmoored from reality that they would do that, there's going to be a problem. Georgia has arrested the opposition leader. They were cracking down today. Tear gas, rubber bullets, water cannons, the whole 9 yards. The people are still in the street, though, and that's what matters. That is exactly what matters. Nuclear weapons are useless in Ukraine. They can't use them. I pray for revolution in Georgia. It may be happening. Oh, yeah, Shadow Hunter, you're right. I mean, we could talk about Russia in South America, too, right? Certainly in Venezuela and in other places. Russia, everywhere that there is chaos on the globe, the Kremlin courts of chaos are there to help it along, there to make sure that it burns. Oh, it's very complicated. It's very, very complicated. You know, PT, I'm not so sure that the U.S. does know that the nuke threats are flaccid. I think that a fear of them has kept us from doing the right thing in Ukraine. I'm sorry to say it, but I do think that it's been fear of those nukes that has held us back. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, and other non-binary folks, you're not wrong, Bobby. You're not wrong. It's 1 a.m. here, and so I'm going to call it a night. I want to thank the moderator team. I want to thank Lars. I want to thank Nightshade. I want to thank the Women's March on January 18th in D.C. We don't know what's going to happen in terms of territory and the ceasefire. We just don't know what's going to happen. So thanks, everybody. I will see you same bat time, same bat channel tomorrow.